maybe 3. Male voices, all speaking in the same rapid Chinese. Dazed, she found herself wishing she'd joined Matthew and Sloane all those years ago when they'd taken their trips to the Far East. Then maybe she could have deciphered what was being said. As it was, all she could make out was the urgency of their tones, mixed with the sound of slamming drawers and what was probably a lifetime of possessions being hauled off. With her tongue, she managed to maneuver the rag to one side, far enough so she could scream. That was a mistake. A drawer thudded to the floor, a whiz of motion, and then another blow that connected solidly with the side of her head. This one was too much. Blinding pain. Then, dark silence. It had started to drizzle when Matthew got out of the taxi and paid the driver. A cold autumn drizzle that left you feeling chilled inside and out. Matthew didn't notice it. He didn't notice anything. He was paralyzed with shock and worry. He'd walked into a Chinatown restaurant to meet his partners, men who also happened to be his oldest friends. It wasn't a social dinner. It was a strategy session. All their necks were on the line, even the 2 of them who hadn't been at the crime scene, and it had been crucial that they nail down the details of the story they'd be giving to the FBI during their individual interrogations. No hesitations, no deviations. It was the only way. Matthew had arrived late and on edge, but he had left panicked, punched in the gut with the very basis for this meeting and sucked into a memory he'd long since buried, or had tried to. Suddenly the past was the present. No, worse, because now what he feared for was his life. He'd stepped out for a smoke. The Mercedes had pulled up to the curb, parking directly in front of the Cadillac Escalade, not 15 feet from where Matthew stood. 2 Mediterranean guys who looked like thugs and were built like linebackers had gotten out of the Escalade and waited on the sidewalk as the driver of the Mercedes, burly and Asian, hurried around to open the back door for his passenger. The man had emerged, emanating power, despite being dwarfed in size by the linebackers. He'd greeted them with a nod, waited for his driver, who was clearly a bodyguard, to be glued to his side, and then led the way, keeping his head down as he walked. He raised it just as he reached Matthew. He stopped. A long moment of eye contact. The recognition had been mutual and indisputable. It was more than enough to tell Matthew he was living on borrowed time. He was barely aware of greeting the doorman at his building or entering the high-rise on York Avenue and 82nd Street. On autopilot, he summoned the elevator, then rode upstairs as he berated himself for being a prisoner to his own stupidity. The elevator door slid open, and he headed toward the apartment. Never had he needed a drink more than he did right now. He unlocked the front door and flipped on the light as he stepped inside. His gaze swept the living area, and he froze in his tracks. The place was trashed, furniture shoved aside, empty recesses left where the flat-screen TV and entertainment center had been. Kitchen drawers were dumped upside down, minus all the unique Art Deco silverware they'd contained. 2 handcrafted sculptures that Matthew had bartered for in Thailand were missing, as was the Monet that had hung over the sofa, and the one-of-a-kind ivory chess set he'd bought in India. And one of Rosalind's diamond stud earrings was lying in the corner, clearly having been dropped. That meant they'd been in their bedroom and cleaned out her jewelry box. None of that meant Jack. It was the other painting. That's why they'd come. The rest was just bonus. They'd broken in because of the painting. Not the Monet. It was one of his lesser-known works, not one of his masterpieces. But the Rothberg. Not the painting itself, but its paperwork. That was what was invaluable and timely, especially after Matthew's encounter tonight. He flung down the portfolio he'd been holding and raced to his office, where he'd find his answer. He found a lot more than that. Rosalind was crumpled on her side in a corner of the room. She was bound to a toppled chair, hands and feet, and her head was half covered by a cloth sack.